One Piece just confirmed that Shanks was a former Holy Knight and the one who freed Fisher Tiger. Now let's get into the Holy Knight reveal because this is a big piece of confirmation. Fans have been talking about this ever since the Holy Knights were introduced and the Figureland connection was hinted at, but now we finally have concrete answers. Shanks really was an official Holy Knight at one point in time. He was, in fact, given the Surface Sea seal, the lowest of the 3 Holy Knight rankings, the others being Deep Sea and Abyss, and these ranking names being based on ocean layers is very on brand for Marijois. Marijois has always portrayed itself as being above the world, literally and symbolically. It has always treated the sea as something it rules over, so basing their elite warrior hierarchy on different depths of the ocean fits their god complex perfectly. The celestial dragons see themselves as gods, and every part of their imagery reinforces that idea. They live at the top of the red line, they look down on everyone, they refuse to breathe the same air as regular humans, they call themselves the Chosen, and they try to control the seas without ever touching them. On top of that, the ranking system also lines up with the Davy Jones myth. It makes you think about how connected Imu might be to whatever the Davy clan originally was, but that's a whole other rabbit hole for another time. For now, it also raises the question of whether these ranks reflect different degrees of control. Does the surface level only allow minimal influence, while Imu needs a higher rank to exercise stronger authority? Maybe Imu can't fully possess someone unless they are Abyss level. If that's how Imu's ability works, then the structure suddenly becomes a lot more meaningful, and it makes sense that Imu's ideal power structure resembles something closer to a sea demon hierarchy than anything else. Shallow sea, deep sea, abyssal sea. The deeper the sea, the more overwhelming the power becomes, and the more power and influence Imu can grant to their chosen knights. These details are definitely something to keep an eye on as the flashback continues. Anyway, Shanks joined the Holy Knights purely based on talent that rivals Shamrock, and I honestly don't know which one impresses me more. Shanks matching someone who grew up with structured Holy Knights training, or Shamrock matching a guy who literally spent his childhood amongst some of the strongest pirates in history. Either way, is this Oda telling us that Shamrock is at least relative to Shanks in strength? Because so far, all the other Holy Knights, including Garling, have been disappointing. If Shanks' baseline is Roger and the other top tier pirates, and Shamrock's baseline is Garling and the Holy Knights, then the scale is heavily in favor of Shanks at the moment, so I'm curious how Oda will portray them side by side. The feeling I'm getting is similar to Sanji versus Germa. We all agree that Sanji is stronger than his entire family, but when he fought Judge and Niji, those clashes didn't look so favorable for Sanji, and in that case it made sense. Sanji was emotionally compromised. I wonder if the Shanks versus Shamrock tension will operate on a similar level, especially if they somehow ended up forming a somewhat amicable relationship, which is what it seemed like from the way they were talking to each other at Marijois. In that case, Shamrock could easily see Shanks' eventual departure as a betrayal. In fact, Shamrock's current uniform is similar to what Shanks used to wear during his time as a Holy Knight, which is a detail I find very interesting. Because for a series like One Piece where details are very intentional, this might have more meaning, as if Shamrock started to intentionally dress like Shanks since his twin brother departed as a form of sentiment. Overall, this shows Shanks in an environment he didn't immediately dominate. Instead, it shows him entering the system at its lowest level, but with so much natural talent and presence that he was immediately recognized as special. And it also instantly gives us a clearer picture of his time in Marijois. It confirms he was a part of the system, trained within it, and evaluated under the same structure as every other Holy Knight. It adds a whole new layer to his backstory and makes his eventual departure from that world even more intriguing. I do wonder how much of the Holy Knights' known abilities Shanks actually had at that point, since every Holy Knight we've seen so far has some form of immortality or regeneration. It opens up a big question. Did Shanks have that too? If he did, that means he literally gave up immortality when he left Marijois. From a pure power standpoint, that would make Shanks insanely OP, but from a narrative standpoint, it adds a new layer to what Shanks sacrificed. When asked about his arm, Shanks said he gave it up for the future. If he sacrificed that arm on purpose to protect Luffy, then he didn't just lose a limb, he gave up whatever power or protection Imu granted the Holy Knights. It becomes a symbolic act of cutting ties with Imu and the world government's control. And as for the giving up immortality part, but if Shanks had it and willingly threw it away, it's such a boss move. You have other characters who spend their entire lives chasing immortality and power, and Shanks just throws it away for a kid in a barrel, if that is really the case. This does bring up the question of why that arm didn't regenerate after it was bitten off by the Sea King. Since every Holy Knight we've seen so far can regenerate, this opens up the possibility that Shanks' mark was already removed after he left Mara Joie, meaning he didn't have that ability anymore by the time he met Luffy. Maybe it was rescinded the moment he walked away from Mara Joie. Because the furthest back we've seen the mark is 14 years ago during the hot spring scene with Shanks and Gaban, where there's a tattoo on his arm. So its removal could have happened in the 2 years before he ever reached Fuchsia Village 12 years ago, and if that's the case, it explains perfectly why his arm didn't regenerate, because he wasn't a Holy Knight anymore. It's also pretty easy to dismiss the idea that losing the arm with the mark disabled the regeneration. I really doubt that's how it works. Gaban heavily implied that Conqueror's Haki is required to defeat a Holy Knight, which immediately rules out a Sea King as the reason why Shanks didn't heal, and we saw Roger and Garp revert rocks back to normal by overwhelming Imu's Domi Reversi control through sheer Conqueror's Haki mass. If Haki is the established counter to Imu's influence, then it's very unlikely that simply cutting off the marked arm is the key. I also have another thought. What if Shanks being in seawater when the Sea King bit him is what prevented the healing? The ocean strips Devil Fruit users of their powers because the sea acts as a natural enemy of anything unnatural, so if Imu's contract-based immortality works like a supernatural enhancement, then it could make sense that seawater would interfere with it the same way that it interferes with Devil Fruits. Maybe Shanks expected his arm to regenerate, but because he was in the ocean the moment it happened, the regeneration never kicked in, and by the time he got out of the water, the mark was already gone, meaning nothing tied him to Imu anymore. Narratively though, it fits so much better if Shanks sacrificed the correct arm on purpose. It becomes a symbolic choice to cut ties with Imu, his family, and the world government. Whatever the details are, that symbolic cutting ties is the main point. Seeing how he got the mark in the first place, cutting it off symbolically severs him from Imu, Mara Joie, the Figureland lineage, everything. Whether Oda confirms the mechanics or not, the symbolism is way too on the nose to ignore. For now, let's just say Oda needed a reason why a guy as strong as Shanks could realistically lose an arm to a Sea King, and now he's giving us that missing context. The Sea King moment seems simple, but the backstory behind it wasn't. This brings us to another injury. Shanks having his left eye freshly bandaged points straight to Teach's involvement in these events, since we know that it was Blackbeard who gave Shanks his iconic scar. That naturally raises the question, what were the circumstances of that clash supposed to be? Because it clearly wasn't just some regular pirate scuffle like many of us assumed. So if we start speculating on what could have happened, there are two main obvious possibilities. The first possibility is that Shanks temporarily left the Holy Land, encountered Blackbeard somewhere out at sea, got injured, and then returned to Mara Joie. And since the Holy Knights don't really handle pirate-related affairs, that's the Marine's job, Shanks leaving the Holy Land could have been for personal motivation, not duty. It paints a picture of Shanks already crossing that line between Holy Knight and pirate without anyone realizing. The second possibility is way crazier, but honestly not so impossible, and that's Blackbeard infiltrating Mara Joie. If it happened, the most logical window of time for it would be during a reverie. That's the one period every 4 years when Mara Joie floods with visitors, nobles, guards, and escorts. It's the easiest time to blend in and disappear into the crowds or pose as someone else. We've already seen Sabo and Bonnie, and now Rox and Harold managed to sneak in during a reverie, so it's already a displayed possibility. And on top of that, Lafitte was already able to infiltrate Mara Joie pretty easily too, even reaching the Warlords meeting, and his connection to Blackbeard makes this possibility even stronger. This timing also lines up with Fisher Tiger's rescue of the slaves. Boa Hancock mentioned she was enslaved for 4 years, and we know the reverie is held every 4 years, so Tiger's climb and escape likely happened during that same high traffic period. If Teach used that chaos to slip inside the Holy Land, that means he was already making moves that align disturbingly well with Xebec ideology. Maybe he wasn't fully executing Xebec's plan yet, but it could have been starting the early stages of it, scouting Mara Joie, searching for something tied to the Davy bloodline, or just gathering relevant information. This would be completely in line with Teach's sneaky nature as well, so if anyone could slip through the cracks of Mara Joie without being noticed, it's definitely Blackbeard. Now the other huge reveal we got is that Shanks was gathering information the whole time he was in Mara Joie. This is massive. This really confirms Shanks as the man with a plan. For some unknown reason for now, he was observing everything, learning how the system works, figuring out where the cracks are. That's not something you do unless you're planning something long term. Why was he doing this? There has to be something bigger at play. Does he have a similar purpose to Dragon, wanting to oppose or eventually take down the entire government? This might also play into his storyline intertwining with Blackbeard. situation. With this new context, if Shanks found out something about the Davy clan, he might have sought out or crossed paths with Teach, and after learning Blackbeard was Zebek's son, it's possible this is when something went down between them, which ended with Blackbeard giving Shanks his iconic scar. Another major detail that was revealed is that Shanks was the one who freed Fisher Tiger. Okay, technically, the sequence frames things clearly enough that this is obviously the intended reading, because during Fisher Tiger's escape, he encountered Shanks, who was drawn as a shadowy figure who broke his chain. Then the Shanks and Harold scene further implied this, so at this point it feels like a foregone conclusion. Shanks liberated Fisher Tiger. We already know the legendary Fisher Tiger story. He was a slave who climbed the Red Line to return to Marijois and free the slaves left behind. But the new reveal adds more context to this story. It turns out Fisher Tiger didn't escape Marijois entirely on his own. Someone from the inside helped him, and the way Oda frames it basically points straight to Shanks. This recontextualizes Fisher Tiger's entire psychology as well. We now get another layer as to why he never discriminated against humans when freeing slaves, including the Boa sisters, and why he rescued as many human victims as possible during his raid on Marijois. And that is because Fisher Tiger was saved by a human. It doesn't mean he wouldn't have helped those human slaves anyway. He may have always intended to free all oppressed people, but this new detail gives extra emotional weight to his worldview. It reinforces his belief that there are countless kind-hearted humans in the world, something he tried to pass on to his crew even as his own trauma made it hard for him personally. And we know how enormous the impact of this is. A single action from Shanks ripples through multiple storylines: the Sun Pirates, Hancock and her sisters, and Fishman Island as a whole. Shanks' influence underneath some of the most emotional and formative moments in the series just keeps growing. With this new detail, it becomes clear that his impact reaches far deeper into the world's major turning points than we originally understood. Oda continues to use his favorite character in the best possible ways. When Shanks appears, it's very brief, but the consequences are drastic. His arrival at Marineford ended the war. His presence in Wano prevented a recovering nation from being destroyed a second time. His elimination of Kid was him removing a volatile threat before it created unnecessary conflict on Elbaf shores. Shanks rarely acts, but when he does, his actions stabilize situations that were spiraling too far. Oda has a great way of fitting and retrofitting Shanks into the emotional spine of the story. He uses Shanks at key turning points, showing how this one man quietly holds the world together. And I talked about this more in one of my videos, the idea that Shanks is the one keeping the balance of the world intact. Everything in these new reveals makes Shanks look way less like that carefree pirate who laughs a lot, and way more like someone who's been making calculated decisions since he was a teenager, which is a far cry from his original intention of forming a laid-back pirate crew with Buggy. This new information reframes Shanks as a quiet strategist and maybe even a double agent, someone who's been gathering information, breaking rules, and setting up moves ages before the main story even began. But these are just some of my thoughts. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below. If you enjoyed today's discussion, please like the video, share the video, and please do subscribe so that you don't miss out on any future One Piece discussions. You can also help support the channel further like these wonderful people by becoming a Patreon or channel member. But as always, thank you so much for listening to another one of my crazy One Piece ramblings. This is Joy Girl, and I'll see you again soon.